Professor Batja Mesquita. How are you, Professor?
I'm doing well. You can call me Batja.
Thank you for your time. It's an honor and privilege to sit down with you and have a chat. As a cultural psychologist, we will talk about emotions, how our emotions we manifest outside, and emotions are key process of social inclusion, success, and even health. So the first question to you is most of us believe that emotions come from inside us, but you argue they come from between us. What does that mean?
Yeah, I don't know that most of us think that emotions are from within us. Focus on emotions as inside event is kind of contemporary and Western. We all have interiors and we all have exteriors, right? We're all experiencing some things and we're all interacting with people and with the environment around us. But I think the emphasis on either can be different. And so, what I mean by emotions are between us is that very often emotions are happening between people and are caused by a relationship, playing into a relationship. When I am ashamed, it's not a feeling inside me, but it's the realization that other people may reject me or that I need to do something to reconnect. When I love, obviously, there is an object of love, but not only it's a relationship. So, yes, emotions often come with some kind of feeling, but also they often come with some kind of behavior, some kind of being in the world.
That means you are talking about that how we react to the situation, how we react to the people around us, that is the emotion.
I think often it is how we respond, yeah, how we give meaning to what's happening between people. Emotions are a way of meaning making. If I'm ashamed, I think that I'm violating norms, interpersonal norms. If I am or proud, I think that I am doing really well. I may even be better than other people, or I may think that our group is doing really well, or my family is doing really well. So, emotions are ways of interpreting the world. So, that's to start with. And they're also ways of being in the world. If I'm angry, it's not only that I interpret it as I'm not getting what I deserve, but it's also want to make sure that I will get what I deserve one way or another. Or if I'm ashamed, I will behave in a way that doesn't give any other reasons for others to reject me, right? I'm sort of assuming responsibility. I want to fit in. I want to make up. So the way of thinking of emotions is very much the meaning giving and or interpretation of what's going on, what my position is in the world, how I see the relationship, stance I'm taking in the world. The main way of looking at emotions is that they're ways of taking position in relationships or in a society.
So that means emotion is an individual thing, what we are manifesting outside, but emotion is actually a collective thing within our being.
So there are many ways in which it is collective. You can have it as a group, of course. You are negotiating with other people, but also the way you interpret the world around you has a lot to do with what is conceivable in your culture. How do you see the world? There are cultures in which anger is very frequent and accepted, and there are cultures in which anger is actually not so conceivable because you, as an individual, are not really entitled. You also may not attribute bad things to other people because who are you to attribute that to other people? It's kind of a claim. There are cultures where shame is a bad thing. In many Western cultures, it's a bad thing because in those cultures, people don't want to be observed or judged by other people. It's a sign of weakness. In some cultures, shame is kind of interpreting the world is actually a strong thing. It's actually reconnecting. So I think that in many ways, the interpretation of relationships is, of course, to a large extent, not determined, but forwarded, made more possible by how people in your environment think about relationships and about the position of a person. The other way in which cultures play a role is, I think, in the very way in which they think about emotions. So, is an emotion something that should get space, or is an emotion something that you may notice, but where you ultimately do something that the environment requires from you? So, they're very different ideas about what it means to have an emotion, how unavoidable it is, how much it imposes on you.
Got it. Okay. A very specific example, let's say we divide the world in two ways, collective society and individualistic society. Collective society people mingling with individualistic society, and collective society people with behaving another collective society people, but they are living in that individualistic world for more than 2 decades, like us. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Can we really fully understand each other?
So there are different ways of understanding. When I wrote my book, I described all the differences in cultures. And then my editor said, so what? What should people take away from this? If you interact with another person or with a person from another culture, what does it mean that there are cultural differences? I think there are two ways. You can sometimes understand emotions not because you can have them or you can imagine them yourself, but because you can understand what is important in that culture. So I think in that way, I call it in the book, I call it resonate with the emotions of another culture. So maybe you would never have it, that emotion. One example, I used to teach Dutch to, when I still lived in the Netherlands, to immigrant women. So there was this Moroccan woman who had a fairly traditional marriage. And once in a while, her husband thought that she would be too free. And then he would tell her that she couldn't go out for a while. She did that because she understood that his honor was at stake, that her being too free would reflect badly on his honor. And so that was okay for her. So it's not something she liked, but it's something that she understood she had to do. Now, could anybody tell me to not go out for a while? I don't think so. I grew up being a feminist, but can I understand that if your family's honor is important to you and if your husband's honor is dependent on you behaving as somebody who is obeying to him, that you would feel that it's better for you to go out? Yes, I can. It's a logical behavior or a logical emotion to have. Part of it is to what extent can we get under the skin of people from another culture? And I think we can probably do a lot more than most of us are currently doing. The other thing is that there are many people who are exposed to more than one culture. And the question is, what happens then? And we've done some research. Basically, what we find is that it takes a few generations for people from immigrant groups to be indistinguishable from the host culture. We also find that if we look more fine-grained analysis, we find that people can have different repertoires so that you can be, say, more Indian at home when you have an all Indian family than you are in a workplace where you're surrounded by Australian people. Spend a lot of time in the US and I've spent a lot of time in Europe, and not that they're greatly differing cultures, but there are certainly differences. And I sort of become more American when I spend some time there, and I become more European when I spend some time here. So we think that for many people, it also works that way, that you acquire more ways of having emotions. If it's a way of looking at the world or giving meaning, you can sort of learn to have different lenses through which you look at the world. So for me, a big difference between the Northern European countries where I spent a lot of time and America is that in middle class America, you're spending a lot of time on looking at how you yourself and other people are unique and special. In Europe, that's really not done. My mother used to say, act normal, that's special enough. You shouldn't stick out. It was just, that was not a good thing.
In
Sorry.
Australia, we call it tall poppy syndrome. Don't be
Yeah.
tall enough. Yes.
I think from what I read, that Australia is more European and it's also a little bit more egalitarian. You don't want to stand out. You want to be like other people. You don't want to be so special. So, yeah, the tall puppy syndrome, I'm immediately aware of it when I come back to Europe. I sort of develop a little bit of it. I mean, my American friends would still say that I don't have as much as they have, but I have a little bit of it when I spent some time in the US. And the reason is not that I'm trying to act like they do. The reason is that I'm trying to see the world, starting to see the world like they do, because there's so many occasions where you say, what did this person do special for me? I'm thanking them a lot more. I'm praising them a lot more. They praise me a lot more. So it also lets me see what is special about me because people say, oh, that's so great that you did that. My mom, when she used to visit me when I lived in the US, she would say, oh, those people, they're faking it. But it's not faking, it's really looking through a different lens. So, back to your first question, that is also one of the ways in which cultures determine or help shape the emotions we have. They highlight certain ways of seeing the world or of being in relations with others and also of acting with others. And of course, there are feelings accompanied with that, but it's also just the way that we navigate the world, where emotions are part of.
Okay. When someone migrates during their emotional acculturation phase, how long typically it takes to come to an acceptance of it? Can we really do it? Or it's just pushing the envelope, compromising it, adapting it, always in that loop?
This is something that we've done some research on. And what we find is that most people who immigrate, their generation, they themselves do not acquire the emotions that are similar to the culture they go through, not entirely. But if you think that emotions are attuned to your environment, then all your experiences count. So obviously, if you've lived 23 years in India, then those years are counting towards the kinds of emotions you have. But you've also lived 23 years in Australia, and those years count as well. So we can predict by the proportion of life that people have spent in a culture. And then there are also individual differences. And the biggest predictor of how much you adjust to your new culture is actually how many relationship or friendships you have in that new culture. In a way that if you have a lot of interactions with people from the new culture or another culture, those interactions are gonna shape you. You're gonna learn to see the perspective of those people. And so within a person's life, the number of friends you have and how good the friendships are, for example, how reciprocal they are, is a predictor of how much you shift. This is when you look at the average emotions that people have. Within that, people are still more, let's say, Indian when they're interacting with people who speak their language, more Australian when they speak English or whatever language they are. So, yes, you change. Any experience changes you. But the question is how much? And again, I also think that your own emotions do not need to change in order to bridge some gaps. You can understand what another person feels, even if that's not your feeling. And that's the example that I gave of the extreme example, of course, of my Moroccan friend, that I could understand how she felt, even if I would never feel that way, because I just don't. I find my individual freedom much more important. But individual freedom is only one of the values you can have. So I can see that if other values are more important, that you can also have other emotions. And the honest question is, we're trying to do some research. These are sort of first results, but there's also a lot that we still need to learn about how people combine the two. We know that people who have friends learn more of the emotional repertoire of the new culture. So it's kind of pushing the envelope. I don't think that it is What you described was fake until you make it. And some of that, maybe, but I don't think you only fake. It's also because that becomes a way, a lens through which you can see the same interactions. Certainly, there's nothing wrong with faking until you make it, but that's not the only thing that happens in my experience, but also in my research.
As we are first generation immigrant, there are a lot of times we have this talk with another parent that some immigrant parent push too much and try to give their kids the origin country flavor in everything, more so how they are thinking, how they are behaving. Some of the kids they become a bit confused, whereas the other spectrum, some immigrant parent they basically just chuck them to the local culture and all. So those kids who are too much into their own original culture, what happens to those kids? They get confused or they come out of it, or how you see it?
It's a really good question, and I can only guess because we haven't really studied it to the extent that I know. I mean, I have a few thoughts. The parents are not the only environment that socializes emotion. There are, of course, their peers, their school. There is a larger environment, just what you see. So I don't know if kids get confused as much. Sometimes we know that that leads to conflict or to misunderstandings between kids and their parents. I'm aware that sometimes the kids who are behave according to values and emotions that they've learned in the new culture, their other culture, that they sometimes are in conflict with their parents. That's possible. But many people also just switch back and forth in many ways. There is no one right way of feeling or being. Yes, there can be conflict, but let's not exaggerate. We also have different emotions. Anybody, even non-immigrants, have different emotions in the workplace and in their family and in their sometimes friend group. And that's perfectly fine. They're different environments that we adjust to. So it can be problematic, but it doesn't have to be. What we know from immigrant research is that there are kids who have no problem integrating the two identities. So they have bicultural identity integration. So they say, yeah, there are these cultures, and I like this culture for this, and I like that culture for that. There are also some kids who really struggle. One reason kids struggle is when one culture discriminates against the other, then it becomes harder to combine the two. There's also a little more when they have really opposite ways of leading your life, and it may be hard. But in itself, there are many kids who say, my parents asked this from me, and that's a little bit different from what the parents of classmates ask from their children. But that's their way. That's not necessarily bad. It's a different way. So there is no one answer, I think, to your question. The way what you say, completely assimilating to the new culture, I mean, is a little bit of a loss of the old culture, I think. There are connections and there are good things about the old culture that you then do not learn, and that could be a loss. There's a little bit of a denial of the past, I think, and it's nice to be in contact with your family's history. But on the other hand, if you as a family decide that this is a better way of living for you and you're all satisfied with it, you lose some of the support and some of the connection with your original culture. That can be a disadvantage. There's no research that says one thing is bad and the other is good.
In immigrants' life, there is another problem sometimes happens or many times happens, which is sense of belonging. Who really struggle more from that belonging sense? Is it education, income, or it's all like the social thing?
That very much depends on the group. So the low status immigrants suffer in education and in job outcomes. But as you know, there are groups that do very well on those aspects. A lot of Asians actually are highly achieving in the new cultures. And there it may be a matter of social belonging. I don't think you can say in general. I mean, there are many immigrant groups that are discriminated in education and the job market, but not all immigrants. How would you answer that question?
Me,
Yes.
as you rightly said, there are few groups who always like to stick within the groups. They don't come out of it because of the communication is one of the major issues, but maybe sometimes it's a religion, sometimes it's a way of life, etc. So
Mm-hmm.
those who don't want to come out from their group and be open about it, they
Mm-hmm.
struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they enjoy when they are young, but when they grow older and all, they kind of lost connection with the society as such. That is
Mm-hmm.
my understanding. Ultimately, it comes down to like social connection.
Immigrant enclaves that are doing very well. So if you have a big enough group that still has social cohesion, that's one thing I want to say, then it can work. You know, you live in Chinatown, you do well, and you have integrated with other people living in country where you are, but you don't have to be lonely. So that can work well. The other remark I want to make is that it very much depends on the context of the host country. So if there is a lot of discrimination and you put yourself out, you want to belong, it actually can be a liability, a vulnerability. Because if you get rejected, even though you do as a group or as an individual everything you can to be accepted, then that can have more negative consequences for well-being than if you were just living in your enclave. We see in Europe, it's not an immigrant country like Australia is, but it's a very closed society with discrimination against many of the immigrants. Several studies that show that the immigrants who actually try to adjust are the ones who are more vulnerable because, you know, they try and get rejected. There are lots of conditions to be filled before you belong, and not everything is in the hand of the immigrants. That's a
Wow.
good, yeah, that's a good thing to know, I think. And so we see that students, for example, who are very much trying to adjust to the new culture and then are in a school that is discriminating against them are actually worse off than the students who segregate. Now, that doesn't mean that segregation is the best strategy, but segregation may be the most psychologically protective strategy when the new country is not hospitable. So it's a little, the answer is, as often the case, is a little more complex.
It makes sense because now I'm realizing my answer is because I'm in Australia, society is
Yeah,
more tolerant and egalitarian. That's why probably my answer is that way. But what you said
right.
is correct.
I wonder how it's changing in America right now, because obviously the environment is becoming less hospitable or inhospitable to immigrants. I'm wondering how it's changing and if it's changing in every environment. And in Europe, we found very different results from the ones that were found in Canada and Australia and previously in the US, which I think is an encouragement to become more hospitable and multicultural, but because that's the best outcomes. But in a certain time segment, it can actually put you at risk.
Hmm. Another kind of belonging people find through spirituality or faith or religion, whatever you call it, coming inwards or going inwards. How, as a cultural psychologist, you see that spirituality really helps someone from this belonging perspective?
Well, it can. There are many ways of achieving belonging. First of all, it can give you a satisfying way of giving meaning. It can help you giving meaning to life. So if you think about feeling well or navigating life well, it can be helped by connecting with a higher being. I don't say it's the only way in which people do it, but it's certainly one of the time-tested ways in which people give meaning to their life. In many cultures, in many societies, historically, people have relied on spirituality to make their life meaningful. There's another way in which it may help, which is that not always, but often spirituality is achieved in group. And of course, having a social community in which you strive for people's well-being and look after each other and help each other finding purpose and meaning is also really helpful. There are other ways of making meaning that are also helpful.
Like
You know, for
like
example, people.
sports or same interest, those kind of things?
I think that's one of them. That's not what I was thinking of. Sports gives purpose and it gives a community to give purpose, but it doesn't help you giving meaning of everything that happens. You could think about a political interest or an activist group where you have a clear shared goal for the world and have a clear way of giving meaning to the events in the world from your activist proposal and have a community built around that. It serves many purposes, except for, of course, the spiritual relationship itself, the relationship with a higher being itself you don't have, but people who don't believe, who in that way shape meaning. I think being part of a community with community purposes may have many of the same benefits, in the sense of having a goal, having a framework of interpretation, a frame of meaning, having a community to achieve the goals. But spirituality is certainly also up there, I would say.
Right. Roughly, there are 27 distinct category of different emotions. Some we call it universal emotions like happiness, sadness, fear, disgust, etc. Some are a bit complex like jealousy, pride, guilt, all these kind of stuff. What about empathy?
Yeah, I just backtracking one. I don't know if they're universal emotions. I don't think anger in one country is exactly the same as its equivalent in another culture. This is a debate in the literature. What I do think is that in every culture there is an emotion that responds to frustration and that somehow doesn't accept the frustration. Having said that, I think almost everything about anger equivalents can be different. But do people everywhere have empathy and does it mean the same? I think we're not so clear what we mean by everything. But characteristic of people is that they can imagine what another person feels. If you see what is important to those people, you can actually relate to them. You have an idea that other people have feelings and you can imagine those feelings. Not necessarily have them, but you can imagine them. I don't know if we should call that an emotion, but certainly we can relate to other people's feelings. The extent to which people do it in different culture is different. There are cultures actually where reading other people's emotions is a bad thing to do. You don't. It's called opacity of mind. They basically say, well, I don't know what another person is feeling. I'm not going to guess about them. And where people talk very little about feelings. So, in that sense, it may not be completely reading feelings in another person, it may not be completely universal. There are also very large differences in what people think you should do with empathy. Should you act on it? Should you make people feel better? Or should you just say, well, I empathize with you? So, there's a word in Japanese that is omayori. I just read an article, but it's really also trying to make the world better, sort of anticipate then what the other person needs. So I think, yes, most cultures can read or can imagine anyway what other people would feel and do so, not all. In most cultures, people have theory of mind, as it's called. You have a theory that other people would feel and think and believe something that may not coincide or be completely the same as what you think and feel. Do we want to call that empathy? Yes, I think most people can do that. And most people in the world seem to think that something is going on in the insides of other people, but not all.
So that means any kind of integration, this cultural integration, whether you are immigrant or non-immigrant, you are local, hyper-local, whatever, sounds like it comes down to it's an individual journey. More you are up on Maslow's hierarchy, you behave differently.
I'm not completely sure I understand what you say. I know Maslow's hierarchy, and so why would it be that the higher you are, the better you integrate.
The more higher you are in the Maslow's hierarchy, then you are trying to look after your own emotions, happiness, contentment, etc. And to do that, you behave more optimally in whatever society you belong. Is that the right way to put it? Or
I don't know that I agree with that because you can behave optimally in a society when you're just trying to take care of your basic needs. I mean, I have problems with what the self actualization is. I think it's a very Western theory. Optimization, of course, could also mean that you do well in the society where that you know exactly how to behave, in a society that isn't so inwardly focused. Everything about how you can reach dignity, how you don't lose face. I think there are many assumptions behind your question, which is that self actualization means that you can reach your own emotions. And that in itself, focus on internal states, I think it's a very contemporary Western middle class thing to do. It's not necessary, I think, to articulate your every internal state in order to fully be a self.
we are almost in the end of it. So the last question to you is peace. Okay. Peace ultimately, it's an emotion, I think. You clarify. If it is an emotion, is it a like a social, political, or individual achievement?
Well, I think you can have peace at every level, right? Peace means being non-violent. You can have that for yourself. You can have that, or being in harmony. You can have it for a relationship. You obviously can have it for a society, and you can have it socio-politically. And I don't know if I have an answer, but I certainly think that striving for peace in interpersonal relationships is also reflected in striving for peace in social political way, but it requires many people striving for peace. And the complicated thing is that when you move up, of course, culture is in the mind. It's in the mind of individuals. It's in the interaction rules, the habits or the activities of a society. And it's also in the structure of international diplomacy and in international structures. So, at some point, it's not only what individual people achieve, but it's also the structures and the institutions that lots of individuals establish together. And for example, I think the United Nations was the international justice was or is a really good system that, of course, people negotiated with each other. Ultimately, it's a job of people, but that becomes a part of culture that in itself has a value and a task in maintaining peace. Is it the same? It's not completely the same because when you build a culture, it's no longer only in the head of the individuals. It's also in the structures and the rules and the agreements that we make together. And they're sort of living a life of their own, if you will. International politics is in parts determined by agreements we made in an earlier stage and the kinds of behaviors that become habitual for states. There are certainly different levels in which peace is achieved. So is it the same? It's based on the same principles. One follows from the other. And also what you see is that at one level it becomes violated, that people, that it penetrates through to even individuals. It's not the same, but they're certainly very connected. Cultural psychologists talk about the cultural cycle, and the cultural cycle consists of big ideas. Is it important to be peaceful? The constitutions, the international law, and then institutions like the United Nations, collateral dialogue, and then interactions. How do people interact with each other? And then, of course, individuals. What do individuals do? Different levels feed into each other. So how do we achieve peace at every one of those levels? Yeah.
On that, we should end our podcast here. Thank you, Batja. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.